Hi everyone, welcome to today's session all about anxious attachment. Now, if you're unfamiliar with what this actually is and you're not aware of what your attachment style is, then I'd suggest to pause this video and hit the button below and go through to a quiz to find out what your attachment style is first, and you'll also get a little bit of a background on what attachment is, and then come back to this video if you find out that your style is anxious attachment. And for everyone that's here, welcome. We've got a lot of information in store for you today to really support you in creating beautiful, loving, lasting relationships. It's probably likely that anxious attachment has impacted your relationships in the past. I know definitely for me it has. I didn't have any problems really attracting men, but those relationships didn't seem to last, and they were just really quite an emotional roller coaster with really painful breakups as well. And if you can relate to that, we're going to talk a lot about like what some of the challenges are with anxious attachment and what you can actually do about it, which makes a difference, because attachment has become a little bit of a buzzword in recent years. And just to recap, it came out of psychological research that was done in the 50s. They discovered that infants or babies attached to their mother or their primary caregiver in different ways. And so they came up with these classifications of anxious, insecure, of secure, and also of avoidant, which is the opposite end of the scale. One of the things that I've noticed since 2011, I've been coaching women through breakups and to creating new relationships and uncovering what their challenges with having healthy relationships have been time and time again. And I mean, like 95% of the women that I work with, this is really the issue for them, okay? And so I'm going to assume that you have a basic level of understanding about what attachment is, and that you definitely know that you are anxious in your attachment style, and talk to you about like what is in the research, what do we know works, what in my experience do we know works, in order to be able to take the information that we know about anxious attachment and actually then translate that in real world behaviors and relationships and having successful, happy, long-lasting relationships, right? And I'm going to pop up just now what we call a continuum. So originally attachment was thought to have been a very strict classification. So you were either this style, or you were secure, or you were this style. And what we know now is that your attachment tends to be somewhere along this continuum, right? So depending on the relationship that you're in, or the dynamic between the person that you're experiencing, particularly with a strong avoidant and a strong anxious, you can polarize each other right out towards the far ends. Whereas if we're with more of a secure partner, it can help to sort of bring us in and can help us to become what's called learn secure, or feel even more secure in relationships. The problem is that if we've had a number of different relationships that have tended to make our attachment even worse, if we've had lots of relationships with avoidant styles, or we do just have quite a significant presence of anxious attachment, even with a secure, healthy partner, we can still potentially self-sabotage that relationship. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the ways in which we might be doing that we're not necessarily really aware of, right? Here's the thing that I commonly find. You find out that you have anxious attachment and you're like, aha, this makes so much sense. You identify so much with the way that they talk about, fear of abandonment and feeling, anxious if he doesn't call back, or really having this, I guess, this body sensation that takes over in relationships that makes you behave odd. And you're not necessarily like that outside of a relationship, but as soon as you meet someone you like, kind of takes over, and you don't necessarily show up as the genuine person that you know you are and that your friends might see, right? But what commonly happens is after we kind of go, oh, that's what it is. It all makes sense. And yeah, that ex-boyfriend and that ex-boyfriend was avoidant. And right now I understand the dynamics, and that was why that happened. And there's a bit of relief in that, right? Because we kind of go, okay, I'm not crazy. This is something that other people experience as well. It's a psychological phenomena, and like now that I understand it, it gives you a sense of comfort and normality. It just sort of makes sense, right? And then you can read up, there's quite a lot of books, and I'm going to recommend some of them to sort of read up and understand this in more detail. And the understanding and the awareness gives you a sense of comfort. For the sake of this conversation, and what I specifically specialize in is how our attachment style impacts our adult intimate relationships and our ability to maintain a healthy relationship long term and feel really happy, safe, and secure in that relationship as well with someone that we're attracted to, right? So I've definitely read a lot of research papers, read a lot of books, read a lot of clinical texts, read a lot of information, but to be honest, and this is also what I experienced myself, is just knowing about anxious attachment didn't necessarily change things for me, even when I started my next relationship and I had all this knowledge and understanding about it. I still noticed those same triggers coming up, the same tendency to panic a little bit and worry if he was pulling away or if he changed his mind. I knew that that's what was happening, but even just with this knowledge, it's like, so how do we actually change things? And that's really what I want to share with you today, because you can go out and read loads of different texts, you can follow people, you can listen to podcasts and probably find some things on YouTube about it, but there's really not a lot out there that's sharing, right, so how do we actually change this? How do we become what's called an earned secure person? How do we have relationships like a secure person that are happy and healthy and last, right? Let's take a look first of all at what some of the key commonalities or symptoms are of our relationship that can potentially be attributed to having anxious attachment, so you can understand the kinds of things that are playing out in your relationships and the kind of things that we have the potential to change. And you'll notice you'll relate to some of these things to a greater or a lesser degree, and that depends on the particular person that you're with and obviously the strength of your attachment activation as well in those particular situations. But all in all, we have some difficulties with our relationships lasting long term, and with our partners or potential partners really stepping up and wanting to commit. We kind of end up with these partners that are just a little bit iffy about talking about the future or really committing in a relationship or fighting for us or creating a space with us in the relationship where we actually feel secure and we don't ever have to worry about them leaving. Like, that's kind of pretty rare, and what our relationships tend to be is a little bit emotional and a little bit on and off. If that's been your experience in more than one relationship, that is often due to some of the things I'm going to talk about now. So we have this tendency with anxious attachment to be drawn to avoidant men, so men who have difficulty with the level of intimacy and closeness and depth of connection that we're wanting. It kind of freaks them out, and they kind of worry about being engulfed by the relationship, about losing some of their freedoms, losing their identity, losing their independence. Whereas what we deeply yearn for is that kind of like that merging and that enmeshment and that beautiful soul deep connection where you feel protected and safe, it feels deep. And so often we end up in love with people and we feel like we're more invested than what they are. We feel like we're putting more into it than what they are. And if we had a healthy attachment style, we would feel okay within ourselves to go, okay, he's not that interested in me. It's sad, I wish he was, but I will withdraw all of my energy from this and and be open to connecting with someone who is equally as interested in me. And that's something that a secure person does, and we find quite difficult. There's a part of us that triggers that deeper fear of abandonment, that we actually just want to fight to have this person, keep this person, even if, as smart, intelligent women, we really kind of know they're not potentially a perfect, ideal partner for us, but we just hold on to this person, right? The other thing that we tend to do is get really caught up in the chemistry or the romance. We tend to use like chemistry and butterfly feelings as a guide for whether, you know, we have an attraction to somebody. And what ends up happening is we end up ignoring a lot of those red flags. And then we end up in relationships with people who aren't committed, who don't want the same things as us, and much worse, which I know some of you have experienced as well, because those signs were there in the beginning, but the chemistry was so phenomenal that we're just like, if it feels this good, there has to be something right about it, right? But what we don't realize is it's actually our anxious attachment system being activated and wanting to draw this person in. It's that anxious sort of adrenaline fight or flight thing that kicks in when we identify this person is usually the thing that we come to expect, that that's what love should feel like, which is not necessarily the case. And so what tends to happen is we get caught in this double bind of we become highly attracted to people that aren't fully in, that don't really want us, that we feel just out of reach, that we have to chase a little bit, or that we just have this deep desire for them to want to like meet us with that same level of interest. And then the men that are there and they're super open, they're interested, they think that we're incredible, they want to spend time with us, we're just not that attracted to them. We don't have those same chemistry or butterfly feeling. It just kind of feels like dull or nothing, and we're like, nah, he can't be my guy because I don't have this like thing for this other person, right? And a lot of you will probably remember it feels like kind of that high school crush, that boy, that, you know, the cool guy, the good looking guy at school that we were all crushing on, and oh, if only he just picked me, right? And it kind of feels a little bit like that. There's this sort of this inner child, this inner girl that's using those sort of old programs to allow our choices in who we invest time with. So what happens over time is we're consistently being attracted to these people that aren't necessarily meeting us there. It's not necessarily a healthy means or healthy way of choosing someone to invest our time is we end up then becoming quite sensitive to rejection and sensitive to abandonment. And many of you will relate to perhaps being a sensitive child as well. And what happens then with that sensitivity is for some of us, it can almost get to a point where we're kind of a little bit reluctant to even put ourselves out there, and God forbid really letting someone know that we're genuinely interested, because the thought or the feeling or the memory or the idea of what it's like to be rejected, it feels shameful, it feels awful, and we don't necessarily make ourselves available. We don't let people know. We can often come across as being a little bit aloof in that way, even though we're not, even though we love very deeply. So we can become quite nervous around men that we're interested in, and perhaps not even able to relax properly, not necessarily able to just really be our true self, like when we're around friends or guys that we friend zone and we're just ourselves, and they think that we're fun and funny and awesome to be around, and yet when there's a guy that we're really interested in, we've got this activated attachment system thing going on that makes us feel a little bit nervy and insecure and doubting ourselves and just not able to relax. The other thing that happens as a result of anxious attachment is we bring self-sabotaging behaviors into the relationship. And this could be anything from just getting so nervous about not hearing from him that we start texting heaps of times, or then to the other extreme where like he hasn't called us and we get ourselves all worked up and upset, but then we're like, damn it, F you, like, and and then we don't take his call. We give him, like, we kind of blow him off, or give him the whole cold shoulder, or make him wait, because finally the ball's back in our court. And we kind of have this, without realizing, introducing like a little bit of a game playing kind of behavior sometimes, that isn't really conducive to just a happy, easy, flowing relationship or courtship as well. When we're in a relationship, because we feel a bit nervous or insecure at times, what we often do is we introduce like testing behaviors. Like we'll say something, or we'll just push him away a little bit, or say things like, well, you don't care anyway, or test him out to see whether he really does, just in little ways. And in order to get validation that he genuinely loves us and he genuinely cares. But it's really destructive to a relationship over time. And even a great secure guy who's really interested in us, if that keeps repeating and repeating and repeating, it kind of wears him down a little bit. Right? And so we need to be really mindful of that. We often aren't necessarily that great at communicating, because we get so overwhelmed with these emotions and these feelings that conversations can become really emotionally charged. And we don't necessarily know how to talk about our needs, how to express our true feelings. And so we can come across as being either really closed off, or we have these like protest behaviors. So it builds up and builds up and builds up, and we're like, I won't say anything, I won't say anything, I won't say anything. And then all of a sudden it kind of like bursts out into some passive aggressive comment, or we end up having an argument like, you don't care, see, you did this, I knew you didn't love me, like, and we just end up having quite poor communication skills in relationships, instead of just being able to sit down and go, babe, this is how I'm feeling, and having a non-emotionally charged conversation about things. And then also too, over time, we kind of know some of these things are unfounded and they're just our insecurities as well. So we get a little bit confused, and we can second guess ourselves. It's like, should I say something about this? Like, is this just me being like an insecure Nelly, or do I really have a right, like, am I really justified in feeling like this? And should I genuinely say something like, did he do something wrong? And particularly if you had a few relationships with avoidant guys, they will be very dismissive of these conversations as well. That would be particularly bad. A secure guy would be great. He'll be really open to talking about it. But an avoidant guy might be like, what are you talking about? You're being ridiculous. Stop accusing me of doing anything. Or they'll be very defensive. And so this becomes learned behavior, right? We don't say anything after a while, because particularly if we're in an anxious avoidant relationship, we've learned that doesn't go down very well. So we don't say anything, right? And our communication skills never really get a chance to be healthy and open and authentic and develop in the way that they should do. And we kind of don't really realize it, because we don't know any different oftentimes. And so what happens is this then continues to perpetuate feelings of unworthiness. We feel unloved, we feel unsupported, we never feel enough in relationships. The more relationships we have that don't last, or with the wrong person, chips away at our self-esteem even worse. And as we know, like, life can be a little bit tough, and feeling really great about ourselves takes work, let alone feeling consistently like rejected or abandoned or never enough in relationships. It can really leave our self-esteem in tatters. And we often have developed very critical self-talk, like talking to ourselves and putting ourselves down, or feeling shameful that we can't hold a relationship down, or why does everyone leave? It gets to a point where we essentially like presume, oh, this is great in the beginning, but I bet he's going to find, he's going to decide that I'm not good enough, or he's going to meet someone else and he's going to leave. It almost ends up becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. What we often do is we slip into over-functioning behaviours as well. Like, we work really hard, we try really hard, we try and be this amazing girlfriend, we do things for him. Instead of it being an easy, beautiful exchange and allowing him to serve us, we try way too hard, and we compensate. And when we compensate, he doesn't have to try as much, so he starts leaning back. And then when he's investing less in the relationship or trying less in the relationship, it's not really stimulating his testosterone and making him feel like chuffed and proud and feeling like he's investing in a relationship. So it can have an impact on the relationship dynamics and the way that he feels as well. With all of this craziness going on and this anxiety and this uncertainty about how he feels and doubting and questioning and fear of abandonment, without realizing it, we have this need to try and be in control of our relationship. And this, we don't usually realize that we're doing it because we think we're just being overly caring or overly considerate or really putting the relationship first and making it important. But sometimes our overly caring, overly committed behavior can come across to him as being a little bit controlling or smothering as well. So just, yeah, that's something to be mindful of. We perhaps wouldn't realize that we're doing it. Another thing that is often really common is overthinking and overanalyzing. So I know this one for me was definitely a biggie, like constantly in my head, constantly thinking, running, replaying over every conversation, every behavior, replaying things in my mind, wondering where he is, what's he doing, what's he thinking, trying to create a sense of safety, like knowing where I stand, feeling comfortable about where I stand, the relationship's in a good place, he's not leaving, like trying to think it all out so I can arrive at a place that feels safe in my mind. And that over-analysing and overthinking and being hyper-vigilant about looking out for all these little subtle changes in behaviours and his texting patterns and all of that, it's not only emotionally exhausting, but it actually takes us out of being present and just being our happy, fun, loving, joyful, natural self, the essence of who it was that he fell in love with in the first place, right? And that hypervigilance can reach extremes when we start to actually intuit that he really is pulling away, and we collect all this evidence, and when it gets really bad, we're unfortunately probably the ones that are most likely to go through our partner's phones or look at his phone records or check up on him or play kind of super detective sleuth, looking through his social media or finding out things from friends and that sort of thing. And if you've done any of that, I totally relate, and definitely then there's sort of a sense of shame around that. What it is just us trying desperately to create safety in that relationship or find out some information that makes us feel okay when we're perhaps not feeling that safe in the relationship. And then what happens is we might get some information, it starts to activate some adrenaline, and then it almost becomes a bit of an addictive thing. We get a bit of a high from doing it because of the chemical influx that happens, that driving past his house wondering if there's someone there or if he's home, and you start to notice your heart rate picking up and things like that. I'm sure you can all relate to examples of that, but there's not a malicious intent behind it. And sometimes we can feel or be made out to be, to feel unstable or a bit of a psycho or something, when it's really just our anxious attachment, right? The other thing that can happen is, and this is what I've noticed a lot, is we tend to have, as anxious styles, very painful breakups, and our recovery time tends to be a lot longer. We tend to have a lot more difficulty detaching from our ex, and we tend to think and play over the relationship so much, wondering, is there anything I could possibly do differently? Almost like a game of chess where you're trying to strategize about 8 moves ahead to see if you can think of something that might create an outcome where maybe you could get back together or where things wouldn't have turned out the way that they turned out. And again, it's emotionally draining. It keeps us hooked into our ex, emotionally energetically, mentally, physically as well. Sometimes we keep going back and back, or we keep allowing them to come back and back, and it does definitely become like a love addiction. And it becomes really painful, because you might reconcile for a little bit, but then there's a really painful come down after that. Because that reconciliation often doesn't last. As I said, there are some of the things that can be avoided when we can reprogram this anxious attachment. But here's the thing, right? It doesn't actually matter how intelligent you are, or how well read, or how much self-development you've done, or how spiritual you are, or how much you know about relationships, or how much experience you have had in relationships, or what age you are, or any of that. Because what's happening, what's driving your romantic behaviors, is actually all happening outside of your conscious control. We're being flooded and overstimulated with all of these feelings that are a subconscious neurological response. This is not things that not what we're consciously intending to have happen. And it literally overrides all of our thoughts, all of our feelings, and all of our behaviors. And the reason that this happens, and what evolutionary psychologists have allowed us to understand, is that in primitive times, when we lived in tribes, we had this innate need to be able to be connected with others, to stay close to our caregiver for safety and security. So that was like a program that humans were actually given in very primitive times in order for us to survive from an evolutionary perspective, okay? Though what happens with some of us is this program becomes extremely strong and becomes activated even in situations where we're not going to die if our partner leaves, right? This program's installed in childhood, but it stays with us, right? It's a little bit like if you were to buy a new phone and imagine that it had iOS operating system on it, but it had no apps, right? There are some of these apps, like this program that we have, that activates our survival, fight and flight, for fear of someone leaving or abandoning us. It's like a very primitive early app that we're still running on our phone, right? Even though it's outdated and it doesn't really serve us. And that underlying fear is that I'm not going to be okay if I get left. And there's a couple of different mechanisms neurologically that cause that. There's a couple of different systems, but for the sake of keeping it simple, it is due to a deep fear of abandonment that most likely comes about as a result of an abandonment situation or a wound or a trauma in our childhood. So the original research talked about this as typically happening between the ages of 0 to 7, and it didn't necessarily have to be like a big T trauma. It might have just been something as simple as your parent not showing up and you getting left at daycare, or you being left to cry and no one, attended to you, or there's a whole range of different situations that wouldn't be considered negligent parenting or parental abuse or anything. We've probably all had multiple examples of things like this that could have happened. I know my sister had some eye problems when she was very young, so sort of around the age of 3 and 4, my parents were constantly taking her to have surgeries and things done with her eyes, and I was left with my grandparents who weren't really that nice. And I remember feeling like, were they ever going to come and pick me up? Did they still want me? How long was I going to be stuck there? And I remember it being feeling really awful. But when you think about it, is that negligent parenting, leaving your child with their grandparents, right? So what happens is we end up having this really, really strong fear of abandonment between the ages of 0 to 7, and we're not even realizing that we have these programs necessarily running, because between the ages of 0 to 7, most of our mind is operating in a theta state, which is a little bit sort of dreamy and sort of below the fully conscious state, which is why we don't necessarily tend to remember a lot about the ages of 0 to 7. The other thing that we're now noticing, and is coming out more and more in terms of the field of epigenetics is that, particularly for the infants, this is pre-birth, right? In the last trimester, if we have a parent who is particularly fearful or anxious, or maybe even a very traumatic birth situation, and the fetus in the last trimester was flooded right through the placenta, which is connected to the mother's blood, was flooded with chemicals like norepinephrine and cortisol, it can also facilitate the installing of these programs, or the activating of these programs through epigenetics. So it actually is changing our genetics even in the fetus. And so there's an emerging understanding of that. And the thing that we notice then as well is that this anxious style doesn't just impact our relationships, it can also impact the way that we are with friends if it's particularly bad, the relationship that we have with our parents, or even just generalized anxiety. You may just feel like you are a little bit more nervous or anxious than other people. So what can we do about it? I've been fortunate enough to work in this field of love and relationships and breakups for 9 years now, and there's two particular areas that I've particularly well researched and specialize in. Starting off, the majority of my work was with breakup clients, and what I noticed helping women come out of a painful breakup, reclaim themselves, release all of their attachments to their ex, and heal the things that were keeping them attached, so that they could then feel whole, happy, healthy, safe, secure without their partner. What I noticed is that the clients that I worked with through this process, so the breakup recovery process, actually ended up getting into new relationships much quicker than the women that came to me single, ready to manifest their partner, willing to do some inner work, wanting to create a strategy to bring in their ideal dream relationship. And it left me wondering, like, why is that? Why is the breakup recovery client who comes out the other end and she's just super happy to be happy and have a great life and had so much inner growth and created some new experiences, upgraded herself and her life, and then she just more effortlessly finds an ideal partner and ends up in a new healthy relationship that lasts after that? And it really comes down to having reprogrammed some of those inner wounds that contributed to the anxious attachment. The more I looked around and looked for, more interventions, more psychological practices, more energy or spiritual practices that could help with this process, the more disheartened I actually became. There's really not that much out there. Things like you can go to a psychologist and they can work with you over a period of time on your trauma wounds. Then that can be a very lengthy, very costly process that spends a lot of time in your childhood. There are other therapists who will also go through a process where, as the therapist-patient relationship, you start to learn to see them as the secure caregiver figure. I mean, you can only imagine how long this takes time to build up this relationship and then actually impact a change within. So I searched and couldn't really find a lot out there, and ended up really over time, and this is, like I said, developed really over 9 years, developing my own system for how to actually repair anxious attachment, rewire and reprogram it for healthy, secure love. And this approach, this is really what I want to share with you, is a combination of from the inside out and from the outside in. So from the inside out, what we really want to do is diminish the strength of those anxious fight or flight anxiety responses that we get that are triggered when we're in partnership with someone else. We want to be able to rewire our autonomic nervous system function so that those triggers just aren't as powerful. They don't take us over us with all of these chemicals and feelings. And so the first step in that, there's two steps. The first step is identifying and healing the core wound, or a couple of core wounds. And even if you can just start off with one, the thing with that is that they are sitting generally in your subconscious if they're between the ages of 0 to 7. You're not necessarily likely to have recollection of them, though you might. Though the one that you have recollection of may not necessarily be the one that's most effective to heal. So what we would do is go into the subconscious. I use NLP. I believe hypnotherapy could also work as another intervention that allows you to do reprogramming at a subconscious level. And undoubtedly there's probably other methodologies as well that work, although you would definitely want to do this work with a practitioner who has experience in attachment wounds. But go in and rewire and reprogram. And then the second step is to install and replace new internal strategies. So it's essentially, if you think of the phone example, go in and find that old app, find where it's running, completely delete it all out and install a new app in there that's healthy, that runs efficiently, that's up to date, that has all of the right sort of emotions and feelings associated with it. And that will actually have a ripple effect in other areas of your life too, especially the areas that, of course, you have low sense of self-esteem or low self-worth. It can be a little bit difficult to do this for yourself, obviously, which is why I recommend you get a practitioner. That just gives you an idea of the first place to start. So that's the inside out for the first step. And then from the outside in, there's two key areas of focus. The first area is creating brand new behavioral strategies in your relationships. Because as an anxious style, I know that we can love like no other. Like when we love, we're 100% all in, fully committed, beautiful, open heart, loving, to a depth of connection that not everyone can get to. And that's a real blessing as well, right? We're very committed. We rarely ever cheat. We always will try our absolute very best to make a relationship work. And we often not usually the ones that walk away in the end, because we are really committed to trying to make it work. One of the things that happens though is no matter how committed we are, we're often not very good when there is an issue, a tension, a disconnection, a fight, an argument, disagreement, or a potential breakup. We're not that great. We're very sensitive. We become very fearful, and we aren't necessarily good at building a bridge and creating connection after there's been disconnection. There's particular skills that you need to learn in order to be able to do that. People who have like a healthy, secure style just tend to have already programmed a different attitude about relationships. They generally tend to assume that everyone is going to be genuine, that if they're interested, they don't have this sense of feeling insecure, like someone's pretending that they're interested but they're probably going to leave, or they might be seeing someone else. They don't have this fearful, uncertain sense of feeling like the other person may be not interested in them. They just assume this. They assume the best of others, basically. If their partner does something that's hurtful or upsets them, they don't assume that that partner did it on purpose or did it knowing that the impact that it was going to have. They assume their partner did something hurtful but they didn't mean it, so they can communicate about it a lot more easily than what we can. And the other thing as well is an empathy. So although we are very sensitive, loving, and generally empathetic people, when it comes to our relationships and we get so overwhelmed in our own feelings, sometimes we get so in our head as well that it becomes just about us, that we actually lose perspective on what the impact of our behavior is having on the other person sometimes as well. Okay, so there's a lot of different behaviors that we need to learn to model what a secure person does in a relationship. The second part of that as well is I really encourage you to learn what's called self-soothing techniques. So when you are feeling anxious or emotional or fearful or worried or any of those emotions, rather than feeling like you need to do something or your boyfriend or partner needs to do something so that you don't feel like that anymore, is learning how to soothe that and regulate those emotions yourself. And that key step of taking personal responsibility for your own emotions and personal responsibility for your own happiness in the relationship, it makes a massive difference, because we tend to have this inner dialogue going that says, particularly when we get hurt, that says like, how could you do this to me? That this is our hurt inner child voice saying, how could you do this to me? And often you'll find that we end up with partners that will say, how could you say that about me? Because we're presuming the worst. We're presuming that they deliberately did it, that they're really hurtful, that they're really mean. We're reflecting back all of our pain onto them and saying, you caused this. How could you do this to me? And they're like, how could you say that I would do that? Right? So that's where learning to emotionally self-regulate, and there's some tips and some tools I'm sharing with you in a PDF download, the buttons below, but I'll talk about that in a sec. Because no matter how much we try, this emotional dysregulation is going to leak out into our relationships unless we learn how to manage it. And for some of us, it can be a little bit like if we've always written with our right hand. This can actually be like learning all over again how to write, but with our left hand this time. It can take practice and intentional practice, because we just write automatically, right? Same with our behaviors in relationships, can just be automatic. So this is very, very intentional work, but I believe that it is the key to having beautiful, deep, soul-connecting, soulmate partnerships, and it's absolutely, absolutely possible. So you can see we've got the behaviors and the self-regulating, and then reprogramming from within, so that the activated attachment is not so bad. It might still be a little bit, especially at the start, but in combination with the change of behaviors, you'll be able to find that you have a really secure, beautiful relationship. Okay, and to give you an example, this time last year for the Love Breakthrough Virtual Retreat, one of the beautiful girls that I connected with was just coming out of a 7-year on-again, off-again relationship. She was an anxious style, he was an avoidant style. It was, I wouldn't say toxic, but their love addiction, the on-again, off-again, coming back into each other's lives, the chemistry, but then hurting each other, like not, it was just never going to work, and she found it difficult to eventually break things off. And that was what we focused on for the first few weeks, is releasing her attachment and all of the levels of attachment to her ex. And then beyond that, we started the process of rewiring all of those attachment wounds and attachment triggers, and then moving on to all of the outside-in stuff, so the self-regulation techniques, and then obviously all of the learned, secure, healthy behaviors. And after, so I think she worked privately with me for about 4 months. And then after that, I would check in with her periodically, how are you doing? And she was just so loving life. She's like, you know what, for the first time in my life, I'm actually perfectly happy being single. I love my life. I'm casually dating a little bit, but I'm not sort of overly invested. I'm not too worried. And she was just genuinely loving her life. So by the time August came around, she actually met an incredible guy. She said, you wouldn't believe it, I wasn't even looking, I was just happily being single. And she's been happily in that relationship ever since. And this is really just one example of many, many clients that I've supported where we focused specifically on changing the anxious attachment, really nothing else, releasing the ex as well. So what I've done is put together a beautiful guide. You'll find the link to download that in the section below. So just click that. It's a recommendations and resources guide. It has loads of great tools, loads of resources, readings, processes. There's even a quiz there if you're curious about whether any of your exes were avoidant or secure styles. You can take the quiz. So there's heaps of stuff in there for you to get started with, okay? And particularly if you're new with this, I'd recommend you just absorb all of the information in there and get a really good understanding of what's this about. If you're just freshly out of a relationship, then the most important thing is to be able to clear yourself energetically, emotionally, and mentally, and release the attachments for your ex first, and then focus on this work. Okay, so really give that your considered focus until you can feel clear and confident and get yourself back and yourself empowered. I have a very specific program that helps you do this within a few weeks if you're interested. It's called Release Your Ex, Reclaim Your Life, and I've made a $200 discount voucher available for everyone, so you can find the details to claim that below the video as well if that's you. And you may not have necessarily recently been out of a relationship, but if you're still feeling some way that your relationship or your connection to your ex is holding you back, you're still perhaps stuck in the past, you can't release him, and it's still an issue for you, then definitely go and check out that program first. If you're someone that genuinely knows, okay, I identify with everything you've talked about, Peter. I realize that this anxious attachment has been an issue for me. I'm really, really ready to rewire this, to reprogram myself for healthy love, and you'd like some support with it. I'm opening up 5 spots to my signature program, Love Reinvention, which is all about reprogramming anxious attachment, and taking interviews for suitable candidates for that particular course next week. So if you'd like to have a chat about it or find out any more information, then there's also a link below the video to book a time in for a chat as well. If you're not already part of the Love Sanctuary Facebook group, that's my private women's Facebook group where I share information, resources and tools and all sorts of things to support your journey to reprogramming your anxious attachment, then go across. It's called the Love Sanctuary, and make sure that you're part of that. I know that many of you already are, but it's great to see you in there, and I look forward to really helping you and supporting you on this journey. Thanks. Bye for now.